You have been eating this bulb your entire life. You have peeled it without ceremony, chopped it without thought, wiped the tears from your eyes and moved on to the next step in the recipe. You have never once stopped to ask what it actually is, what it was, what it once did for the people who understood it completely, before the people who came after them decided it was merely a flavoring. The onion is the most widely grown edible bulb on Earth. It has been cultivated for longer than most civilizations have existed. It was buried with pharaohs, it was rationed to armies, it was pressed into wounds on battlefields before anyone had a word for infection, and it worked, not by coincidence, but by chemistry that took 3,000 years of human observation to record and another 100 years of laboratory science to partially confirm. And yet what you buy today, wrapped in a mesh bag under fluorescent light, is a shadow, a selected, simplified, shelf-stable replica of something that once carried compounds so concentrated, so biologically active, that ancient physicians prescribed it for conditions we now treat with pharmaceutical drugs. The knowledge did not disappear by accident, it disappeared because what cannot be patented cannot be sold, and what cannot be sold is, to the systems that now control your food, invisible. This is Ancient Food Files. We document the crops, the compounds, and the agricultural traditions that were buried not by time, but by design, the things that were too old to own, too distributed to control, too effective to be permitted to remain outside the boundaries of commerce. Before you continue watching, please check the link I provided in this video's description, that way, you can verify it yourself. If what is recorded here belongs somewhere other than forgotten, subscribe, not to a channel, to a record, so that what follows does not have to be recovered again. Now let us open this particular archive. Let us begin where the onion began, not in your kitchen, not in a supermarket, not in a greenhouse in Holland or a processed food factory in the American Midwest, in the dry, mineral soil of Central Asia, where the air is cold at altitude and the growing season is short and the plants that survived there learned to store everything they needed for the future inside a single, layered bulb. The oldest confirmed evidence of onion cultivation comes from the Indus Valley Civilization, approximately 5,000 years ago, but the plant itself is older than that record. Wild Allium cepa, the ancestral onion, grew across a range stretching from what is now Iran through Afghanistan and into the western foothills of the Himalayas. It grew in rocky, nutrient-poor soil at elevations where most plants do not attempt survival. The Sumerians recorded it. Their cuneiform tablets from around 2500 BCE document onion cultivation as a civic responsibility, gardens maintained by the state, harvests distributed through official channels. The onion was not a luxury, it was infrastructure. In ancient Egypt, it occupied a different register entirely. Workers who built the great monuments at Giza were paid partly in onions, garlic, and radishes. This is documented in inscriptions on the pyramid walls themselves, not folklore. Stone. The Ebers Papyrus, written around 1550 BCE and representing a compilation of Egyptian medical knowledge that likely stretched back centuries further, lists the onion as a treatment for over 24 conditions: heart problems, parasitic infection, wound management, respiratory obstruction. The Egyptians did not use it symbolically, they used it with the precision of people who had observed its effects across generations and recorded what they found. The onion was also sacred, it appeared in tomb paintings, it was placed in the eye sockets and the body cavities of mummified dead, not as food for the afterlife, but because the priests believed its circular layers represented eternity. The concentric rings of a sliced onion were, to the Egyptian religious imagination, a map of the universe folding back on itself without end. This was not superstition, it was a culture expressing, in the only language available to it, the observation that this particular plant was unlike anything else growing in the earth. The onion is a biennial. In its natural cycle, it grows leaves in its first year, stores energy in its bulb through winter, then flowers and seeds in its second year. The bulb is not a root, it is a compressed stem, surrounded by layers of modified leaves that have been converted into storage tissue. Everything the plant will need to survive cold, drought, and dormancy is locked inside those layers. That storage chemistry is extraordinary. The onion produces a class of organosulfur compounds, among them allicin precursors, quercetin, and a flavonoid profile so dense and varied that researchers studying it have compared its biochemical complexity to medicinal plants that took centuries to gain pharmaceutical recognition. When the bulb is cut, an enzyme called a linase is released. It converts stored compounds into volatile molecules. This is what makes your eyes water. It is also, the science now confirms, part of what makes the onion one of the most biologically active foods ever consumed by human beings. The plant does not need irrigation in its native range. It does not need fertilizer. It self-regulates its dormancy in response to temperature and day length with a precision that agricultural scientists still study for clues about how to breed more climate-resilient crops. The bulb can be stored for months without refrigeration, losing very little of its chemical content. It was built for exactly the kind of world we are returning to, a world of irregular rainfall, shortened growing windows, and supply chains that cannot be trusted. In 1858, Louis Pasteur documented the antibacterial properties of onion juice. This was not a discovery, it was a confirmation. Physicians across multiple civilizations had been applying onion preparations to wounds for thousands of years. What Pasteur did was attach a mechanism to an observation that had never required one to be useful. During the First World War, British and Russian military physicians applied onion and garlic juice to battlefield wounds when antiseptic supplies ran short. Field reports from the Western Front document its use in the treatment of gangrenous infection. It was not a last resort born of ignorance, it was a deliberate return to a technology that predated the pharmaceutical industry and did not depend on it. In the winter of 1918, as the Spanish influenza swept through populations already weakened by 4 years of war, there are documented accounts from rural communities in parts of Europe and North America where illness rates were markedly lower. Some of these communities shared one observable trait: they were farming communities. They had access to raw alliums and consumed them regularly, in quantities that no modern nutritional guideline would recognize as normal. These accounts were not followed up. The influenza passed, the pharmaceutical industry was growing. The connection between the onion and the survival rate in those particular communities was noted in a handful of regional medical journals and then, quietly, not pursued further. The industrialization of the onion followed the same logic that reshaped every other crop in the 20th century. The question was not which variety was most nutritious. The question was which variety could be grown at the greatest scale, harvested by machine, stored the longest, and transported without loss. The answer was not the varieties that had been cultivated for medicinal and nutritional value across millennia. The answer was varieties with thicker outer skins, lower water content, higher sugar concentration, characteristics that made them durable in a supply chain but that corresponded, in many cases, to lower concentrations of the organosulfur compounds that made the onion biologically significant in the first place. Thousands of traditional onion varieties exist in the historical record, regional varieties adapted to specific soils and climates over centuries of selection by the farmers who grew them and ate them and observed their effects. The Welsh onion, the Tropea onion of Calabria, eaten raw for its reputed cardiovascular benefits, the Riscoff onion of Brittany, cultivated since the 17th century and documented in French pharmacopoeia, the Walla Walla, the Vidalia, the red torpedo, each representing a distinct chemical profile, a distinct adaptation, a distinct relationship between plant and place. Most of these are now grown by hobbyists. A few are protected by regional designations that function more as tourist marketing than as genuine agricultural preservation. The seed stock for the majority has been consolidated into the catalogs of a small number of corporations whose selection criteria have nothing to do with the compounds that made the onion sacred to the people who first grew it. It was simply unmanageable, too diverse, too old, too unownable to be permitted to remain at the center of a food system that required predictability above all else. In 2011, a research team at the University of Bern published findings on quercetin, one of the primary flavonoids in onion, and its interaction with the SIRT1 gene, a regulator of cellular aging that had become one of the most studied targets in longevity research. The findings were cautious, as good science is, but they pointed in a direction that was impossible to ignore. The onion, consumed in the concentrations that were normal for pre-industrial populations, delivered quercetin at doses that in controlled conditions demonstrably influence the biological mechanisms associated with oxidative stress, inflammation, and cellular senescence, the processes most consistently linked to age-related disease. A 2019 meta-analysis published in the British Journal of Nutrition examined 42 studies on allium vegetable consumption and cardiovascular disease risk. The correlation was consistent across populations, across study designs, across decades of data. Regular consumption of allium vegetables was associated with significantly reduced cardiovascular mortality, not marginally, significantly. These findings did not generate pharmaceutical interest. There is no patent available for a bulb that has been growing in the ground for 10,000 years. The science arrived quietly. It confirmed what the Ebers Papyrus recorded 3,500 years ago, and then it was filed, and the supermarket continued selling the same thin-skinned, low-compound, shelf-optimized bulb it had always sold. The onion did not need saving. It is still in the ground. It still produces the same compounds it produced 10,000 years ago in the rocky foothills of Central Asia. It still layers itself against dormancy and cold with the same compressed efficiency. It still releases its chemistry when cut, still feeds the soil, still grows without instruction in conditions that would end most of what we now depend upon. What changed was not the plant, what changed was our willingness to pay attention to what it was telling us. The soil is patient, the bulb is patient, the chemistry locked inside those concentric rings has been waiting, without urgency, for the moment when the systems built around ignoring it become too fragile to ignore it any longer. That moment is closer than the supermarket shelf suggests. If this history belongs somewhere other than a footnote, subscribe to Ancient Food Files. We document what was set aside, so that the next time someone hands you an onion and calls it ordinary, you will understand precisely what ordinary has been made to mean.